these empires are amassing extraordinary amounts of resources by dispossessing a majority of the world. That includes like the data that they're extracting from people by just scraping it from online, or intellectual property that they're taking from artists and creators. Most AI researchers now work for the AI industry and or are funded in part by the AI industry. Even academics that have stayed within universities are often funded by the AI industry. And the effect that has had on knowledge production is akin to the effect we would imagine if most climate scientists were bankrolled by the fossil fuel industry. I cannot stress enough how much they genuinely believe that they are on the path to creating something akin to an AI god, and that this is going to have cataclysmic shifts on civilization.
Welcome to Analyse podcast, the premier podcast dedicated to dissecting the powers of business, technology, and media globally. Today, we explore one of the most consequential questions of our era: who owns the empire of AI? With me is Karen Hao, investigative journalist and author of her very famous book now, Empire of AI, a sweeping examination of how companies like OpenAI, Anthropic, and xAI have become modern empires, shaping the future of society, labor, geopolitics, and democracy itself. Karen, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, I think we crossed paths with a couple of friends, and I've asked them to all recommended me. So I have to thank Grace and Jin Yang for getting you onto the show. So I actually want to understand, how did your career journey begin, and what led you from doing mechanical engineering at MIT into journalism, and now deep diving into the coverage on artificial intelligence?
Yeah, it was very much by accident that I got into this career path. I studied engineering thinking that I would go work in the tech industry and have a very traditional trajectory in tech. But then when I started working in San Francisco at a startup and being part of Silicon Valley, I realized that the Silicon Valley model of innovation incentivizes profitable technologies, but not necessarily technologies in the public interest. That's why I went into tech. I wanted to build tech in the public interest. And when I didn't really see a pathway forward within San Francisco, I thought maybe I could just switch to a more publicly aligned industry. And that's when I went into journalism and started covering the tech industry. And my first job just so happens that I was assigned to cover artificial intelligence.
I think you have covered the tech industry for years. I think you've seen idealism and also its dysfunction as well. What are the biggest lessons you have taken away on reporting on AI within Silicon Valley and the culture that shapes AI today?
My biggest takeaway is that I think the initial feelings that I had working in tech have largely played out and gotten worse, that this industry has become more and more powerful over time and has wielded that power in ways that continue to distort the ecosystem of innovation towards making technologies that primarily benefit them rather than benefit a broad base of people around the world. And one of the important functions of journalism is to hold power to account. And so, whereas before, I think tech journalism was seen more as similar to science reporting, where primarily the role is for the journalist to explain a technology to a lay audience. Now I think of tech journalism as more akin to political reporting, where you are trying to hold a core power center of the world accountable to other people.
So I think maybe we should just get straight into the main subject of the day. I want to start off with the core of your book. So why do you have came up with the propositions that companies like, say, OpenAI, Anthropic, and X.AI can be understood as empires of AI? I think that's the core part of this, how this book was built upon.
Yeah, very, very related to what we were just talking about, which is that these companies have consolidated an extraordinary amount of not just economic power, but also political power. And the way that they're going about consolidating this power is very similar in terms of tactics to what I call the empires of old. And there are basically four parallels that I lay out in my book, but you could broadly summarize them as these empires are amassing resources, extraordinary amounts of resources, by dispossessing a majority of the world. That includes like the data that they're extracting from people by just scraping it from online, or intellectual property that they're taking from artists and creators, the economic value
Mm,
that they're extracting from labor that rarely sees proportionate economic value in return. It also involves this ideological quest that undergirds the AI industry's expansion. So if you look at what the AI industry does purely from a profit perspective, you actually wouldn't get a full picture of why it's doing what it is, because the business logic is not 100% sound.
mm,
But there is this kind of quasi-religious quest that also pushes the industry towards building larger and larger models and consuming more and more resources to do so. It's because they believe that they are ultimately trying to build an artificial general intelligence, an AI system, a theoretical AI system that would be akin to a human, or what some people colloquially call an AI god.
mm.
And so the fusion of capitalism and ideology and the extractivism and the expansionism, like all of these things are essentially very fundamental characteristics of empire.
So I think the four traits you mentioned is kind of, if I rewind it correctly, is the resource extraction, the labor exploitation, the knowledge monopolies, and there is this good versus evil narrative that's going on. And then at the same time, coupled with this obsession about building AGI, which of these do you think that the world still underestimates most in terms of when they see these AI companies at work then?
It's a good question. I would say the third one is probably
The knowledge
least
monopolies one.
talked about.
Mm,
Yeah, because yeah, so to I guess to flesh out that particular parallel more,
mm,
I don't think most people realize how much AI research as a scientific discipline is no longer truly scientific, because most AI researchers now work for the AI industry and or are funded in part by the AI industry. Even academics that that have stayed within universities are often funded by the AI industry. And the effect that that has had on knowledge production is akin to the effect we would imagine if most climate scientists were bankrolled by the fossil fuel industry. Like it just, we would not get a clear picture of the climate crisis, and we're not getting a clear picture of the true limitations and capabilities of AI and
mm,
especially these frontier models. And this is one of the things that when I speak with policymakers also is central to their inability to consult with independent experts to put together sensible policy for holding the companies accountable, or even just like fact checking the company's claims. This is one of the challenges, is that most of the experts that they can consult are in some way financially tied to the industry. And so there is just this like echo chamber of self-reinforcing opinions that all lead to just the AI, like people agreeing with what the AI industry says and its agenda. And yeah, that is like a very shaky foundation upon which the industry has been allowed to continue doing what it's doing without really having many people challenge
mm.
what it does and says.
Truth be told, I was working in the AI in the Human Genome Project, and actually, when I recently looked at all the LinkedIn with the people I worked with, including myself, none of us escaped working for a tech company. So, I think one curious question is, what's the one thing you know about the global AI industry now that very few people do, yeah, other than just, the part where there's the knowledge monopoly side, but also the kind of the cost that the AI has actually inflicted upon society as a whole.
Different from the previous answer,
Yeah.
I guess I would then pick the fourth parallel that I draw, which is this ideological.
Yeah. So the good versus
Uh,
evil narrative.
yeah, well, I think the thing that people don't really pick up on is the degree to which there are what I describe as quasi-religious movements in Silicon
Mm,
Valley. Like
yes.
it's really hard sometimes to explain the crazy cultural aspects of San Francisco in particular to someone who's never been there, who's never talked with these people, because anything that you say to describe these people sounds crazy if you haven't been exposed to their ideology directly. And so, yeah, that it's just like the way that these people talk, like I cannot stress enough how much they genuinely believe that they are on the path to creating something akin to an AI god, and that this is going to have cataclysmic shifts on civilization. And they've developed an entire vocabulary around this. Like when you listen to them talk, if you have not been exposed to their fanaticism in the past, you wouldn't even understand what they're saying because their vocabulary has become so specialized and like
This is actually due to a lot because of science fiction, but also science fiction also gives you the parallel. Like for example, Foundation, they end up destroying all the robots, and then like in Dune, the same thing happened. They destroy all the AI as well.
it is there is definitely a science fiction element to it, which is that a lot of the people who work in the AI industry and are big fanatics of
Mm,
creating AI were huge science fiction buffs growing
mm.
up. And there is this kind of tantalizing premise of f getting to be part of now the quest to turning these science fiction dreams into reality.
Mm. So the one thing I did pick up from the book and also looking at all the different AI books I've read is that the founding of OpenAI, the origin story is actually quite interesting. It was particularly the Sam Altman and Elon Musk dynamics, and then that unusual non-profit for profit structure. How did it create the kind of governance problems that we see today? And also all the offshoots, like for example, the Anthropic team also came from OpenAI and it broke out and started their own team. And now we have SSI and all the different other companies that evolved from that.
Yeah, so at the time, Musk and Altman created OpenAI as a nonprofit specifically because Musk in particular really did not like the fact that Google was dominating AI development and Google was a for-profit. And so they thought, let's create something that's the antithesis to Google. That said, like in like after reporting out the whole first 10 years inside story of OpenAI, in hindsight, I my guess is that there was not high conviction from Altman in keeping OpenAI a nonprofit, even back then. Like, I think he probably saw there to being like high utility to starting it as a nonprofit to accumulate some goodwill, create a positive narrative around the org, and also to recruit a lot of talent because they couldn't compete with Google on salaries, but they could compete with Google on a sense of mission. And that is, in fact, what allowed them to recruit Ilya Sutskever, who became the chief scientist of OpenAI and was like the first major important hire for the company. But of course, then OpenAI ultimately, like they within a very short amount of time, decided they wanted to pursue a path of AI development that was very capital intensive. They couldn't
Mm,
retain a pure nonprofit. They create this for-profit arm within the nonprofit, and that is the heart of all of the governance challenges that OpenAI then faces because they recruited some people on the basis that OpenAI is a nonprofit, and they recruited other people on the basis that OpenAI is a for-profit. And so it's one of the only organization I've ever covered where there's a fundamental confusion among employees about what even the organization actually is, just in terms of like, is it actually mission driven or is it profit driven? And because of that clash, there are different factions within the company that believed in one or the other, and then would have these really big fights over whether a decision about like, should we build this technology or that technology? Should we deploy it faster or slower? Were tied up in their philosophical differences about what they believed OpenAI was. And so to what you were mentioning, Anthropic was founded by former ex-OpenAI
mm.
executives
Yeah.
because they disagreed on this fundamental premise.
Yeah. So I guess this was one of the aspects. And then 2 years back, we had that firing of Sam Altman, which was also quite dramatic in terms of tech history, right? I think from how you observe it and looking backwards now, 2 years later, right? What do you think was the board's decision then? And does it actually, on hindsight, if everything had played out then today, does it actually reveal how the governance of AI has actually now accelerated more as compared to it was within control at that point in time? Or maybe all along, this whole AI train is just going to go in the trajectory it should have been.
I don't think the board makeup at that time was in any way effectively holding the company accountable. I mean, clearly it did not because when it tried to hold the company accountable, it failed. And I think part of it is because inherently even that board was acting in a very anti-democratic way, which is they weren't, broadly consulting lots of different stakeholders about the direction of the company. They were deciding amongst themselves what the direction of the company should be. Just in the same way that OpenAI's current executives are deciding amongst themselves without actually consulting with the public about what the direction of OpenAI should be. It's just like the direction for each group. Each group has a different idea of what the direction should be. But yeah, basically what happened was that the board was much more leaning towards the doomer ideology, which part of these quasi-religious movements believes that AGI is imminent and the cataclysmic shift that arises will potentially be devastating to humanity. And OpenAI's actions at the time were more boomer leading, which is this belief that the cataclysmic shift that comes will be extremely utopic. And so they clashed. The board was deeply concerned about the direction that Altman was taking the organization, and they were also deeply concerned about feedback that they were getting from Altman himself or about Altman himself from his senior lieutenants who were flagging that they felt that he had a pattern of abusive behavior, of manipulative tactics, of being untrustworthy. And that is what led them to decide that they should oust him. But I don't think you could say that OpenAI has since then accelerated more because the board is no longer philosophically opposed to the CEO, and everyone, executives and the board, are now pointing kind of in the direction of boomer, just pedal to the metal, accelerate the expansion of this technology as quickly as possible. But in terms of like the governance of the org, I don't think we were in a better state before than we are now. Like all of it was not a good, robust setup for governing one of the most consequential technologies of this era.
And I think now it's a lot more reviewed with the recent deposition from Ilya during the X.AI OpenAI trial. And then you also have some information from the information which recently talked about actually almost Anthropic. Dario almost came back to take it back over and all that. So had that alternative history. We will be really interesting to see what the alternate universe look like. But let me just ask this question then. Given that all the founders now left OpenAI, or even part of the founding team of OpenAI have now created their own labs to pursue their own idealized versions of what AI should be, are we witnessing more fragmentation or more consolidation of AI power amongst all these players?
We're definitely seeing more fragmentation in terms of the number of competitors that there are. And it's not a coincidence that every single billionaire has an AI startup. I think this is evidence number one for realizing that the AI race is driven in large part by ego, and each billionaire wants to make AI in their own image and has a story that they tell themselves and the public about why their version of AI is the morally superior version as compared to all of the other billionaires' versions of AI. But I said fragmented, but also I think it would be a mistake for people to view this as somehow a distributed, what's the right word? That somehow power is now being distributed more evenly across like the broader public, because of course it's still all elites that are like consolidating their approach to
still actually is now maybe concentrated between two countries, which I didn't mention, China and the US. But there is this point of view that the US policymakers and even all the American AI builders, they use China as the rhetorical shield to resist regulation, right? I think maybe I don't know how much your understanding of the China AI ecosystem is. How do you contrast between, say, the US and the China AI ecosystems, or from your perspective, just seeing how things played out publicly so far?
Yeah, I'm definitely not an expert on the China AI ecosystem, and I would direct people once again to Grace and Jing's reporting. They're my go-to sources as well. But I think broadly, just from reading some of their reporting and watching the movements in the industry, like I would say that the biggest difference that has happened this year is that because for the last few years, China did not have access to cutting edge computer chips because of US export controls, many Chinese companies ended up just taking a different path from Silicon Valley, where they are innovating around the, instead of trying to just scale and build larger models based on the amount of computational resources, they have innovated around and found ways to do it much more efficiently. And that is what's leading to a blossoming of a lot of different, more efficient models that then they are open sourcing, and has led companies in the US as well as academics in the US to actually increasingly turn to Chinese open source AI models instead of American closed source ones, which has been one of the most fascinating trends that's happened.
It's quite interesting to see the Airbnb CEO talking about Quen as the model that they use, and he's not using even the OpenAI open models, right? Isn't that ironic from that point of view?
Yeah, it's super ironic. And it's like, I think there's this like really big narrative in the US and Europe right now. I don't know if this is also true in Asia, that regulation is antithetical to innovation. And yet, like, this case study shows that with the right regulation, you can spur enormous amounts of innovation, because when the US placed export controls on these Chinese companies, like, that was a form of regulation that hindered their ability to take the same path as Silicon Valley. And then within that pressure cooker, they figured out a way around it. So yeah, it's just like incredibly funny, you could say, that things panned out this way.
Yeah, I find it ironic because the most controlled environment is open sourcing it, and the most democratic environment is trying to control it. So it seems like they're doing what each other didn't want each other to do. But so for global audience, right? What are the biggest misconceptions, say, for governments have when they think about how AI is developed, deployed, and monetized?
One of them is that, I don't know if this is quite like answers your question, but like a
Mm.
common misconception that I've heard is people believing that American companies somehow have American values. So that exactly what you just said. They think that like Silicon Valley, because it is in the US, which is on paper a democracy, that somehow these companies are also ultimately trying to build democratic AI. And OpenAI perpetuates this narrative by, they say in company blog posts that they want to bring democratic AI rails to countries around the world. And this is how they're courting a lot of governments. And what I'm trying to help people realize, in part through the book, is that actually Silicon Valley should not be thought of as part of American democracy. Like, it is its own power center with its own political agenda that is not in line with the American political agenda most of the time. And it's actually like an inherently very anti-democratic place, which is why you see them really trying to exert more and more control and develop closed source models rather than the open source route. And I think if policymakers understood that more, that they are ultimately interfacing with companies that have their own ideological bent, that would lead to more sound understanding of like who are they actually interacting with.
I thought one of the most striking parts of your book, which I read it, and then because I teach a class in generative AI in the university here in Singapore, is the part about the real AI supply chain. We talk about the annotation workers, the content moderators, or communities that's actually hosting data centers. I do tell one of those stories that, the AI that you are using shouldn't be taken for granted, because there's a lot of people who put blood, sweat, and tears
Mhm.
involved in it. What does that actually teach you more about how what are the things that Silicon Valley actually, the AI companies consistently overlook?
I don't know if it's overlook more than just like deprioritize or do not care about or are negligent of, which is just their like the the fact that they're perfectly comfortable with the degree to which their technologies are built on labor exploitation and environmental extraction. There's not any confusion
Mm.
among employees about the fact that this happens. And it's more just that they justify it because they use a utilitarian, the ends justify the means kind of logic, where they think that if they're ultimately on the path to AGI, then it doesn't really matter what harms are inflicted along the way. And that is the part of the ruthlessness of the empire.
Mm. And then, of course, the story of the Chilean water activists, right, that resisted a data center. So I think what are the things that the global audience or maybe other parts of the world they can learn from this experience as well, from the book? You covered that. I thought it was quite interesting story to talk about.
Yeah, so there's this group of Chilean water activists called Mosacat that I profile in the book who in 2019 they realized that there was this Google data center that was being proposed within their community that could use freshwater resources to cool the facility. And when they started looking into the numbers, they were completely alarmed by the degree to which this facility could take up their water resources at a time when Chile was suffering a historic drought. And so they just decided not to accept the project. And they essentially protested in every form possible. They protested in the streets by canvassing their neighbors. They protested to local politicians and really applied a lot of pressure to local politicians to do something to stop the project. And they were so effective at raising the alarm around this particular facility that it escalated all the way to Google Mountain View, which then sent representatives to speak with the communities, and then escalated all the way to the Chilean national government, where the government started thinking about how do we actually make sure that other data center facilities that come into our country do not end up engaging in this kind of extraction. And the outcome, which is sort of still ongoing, is thus far, Google has agreed with the community that they are not going to use fresh water for cooling the facility anymore, which is a major win for that facility. And also the government, the Chilean government has created this roundtable to consult with residents and activists for all future data center projects to establish a more democratic governance structure around these projects. And to me, this was such an inspiring story of how to actually hold these companies accountable. Like you could say that these Chilean water activists were have the least amount of power in the global world order. They are in a developing country and in an impoverished neighborhood within that developing country. They all work on a volunteer basis. Like they don't have any funding, and yet they're going up against one of the most powerful companies in the world from the most powerful nation in the world. And they were still able to significantly establish guardrails around that company's activities as well as future activities to come. And so that is the kind of spirit that I think everyone, no matter where you sit in society, needs to have to hold these companies and technology development accountable to the broader global public. Is everyone should feel that they have agency and voice to push back when these companies do things, whether in their local community or their country or the broader global community, that they don't actually agree with. And if we all did what the Chilean water activists did, I think we would get to a much, much better place with technology development where we see in the innovation ecosystem bend more towards the public interest.
Mm. I think that there's also similar cases that just happened in the last couple of months in the US. I think there was a Microsoft and a Google data center project that was got blocked by the local communities. I think we all know, even as an AI person myself, I know that the environmental demands on large-scale AI, specifically energy, water, and compute, are actually rarely part of that conversation. We talk about it, but people don't realize how important it is. I think maybe my question for you is how severe are these externalities, and also what kind of trajectory are we now on in terms of the natural resource side that's inflated, of course, by where the AI is going?
Yeah, well, Sam Altman, like when I wrote the book, the numbers that I have in my book were based on reporting that had come out at that time that OpenAI was considering building supercomputers that could eventually, like within a few years, be powered by 5 gigawatts. And at that time, like 5 gigawatts is almost equivalent to the average power demand of New York City. And so they were talking about this one facility that could take the power demand of this huge metropolis.
Yep.
And that in and of itself was already shocking. And now fast forward a year, and Altman is talking about building 250 gigawatts of data center capacity, which he estimates could cost $10 trillion. So that is now 4 dozen New York cities of power because New York it's 5.5 gigawatts average power demand. And
Mm.
so like that is just like if we and he wants that to happen by 2033. So if we actually follow through with what the AI industry wants, and that's just one CEO, one company, and then think about like all of the other companies that would then try to compete to build similar degrees of infrastructure, that would be incredibly environmentally devastating because the energy that would be used to power those facilities will largely come from fossil fuels around the world since there is not enough nuclear capacity. We wouldn't be able to build the nuclear capacity fast enough. And renewable energies are just not sufficient for running these facilities 24/7. And that would be huge amounts of emissions that go into the atmosphere, as well as huge amounts of pollutants that go into people's air and water and lead to an exacerbation of existing public health crises. So that, yeah, it is something that like we cannot afford to allow to pass.
Mm. But then also, do you feel that now, in terms of the frontier model research, I think it's also slowly kind of reaching some kind of asymptotic ceiling and maybe shifting towards, products. So what does that really mean for the AI development in the next 5 years then?
So what we've seen, the trend is specifically scaling the base model has seen it approach an asymptote,
That's right.
but the companies are now shifting to continuing to scale the inference compute.
Mm,
And that hasn't approached an asymptote yet in terms of how Silicon Valley wants to approach things.
mm,
And like just to highlight again, even though we've already talked about this, like this scaling is actually completely scientifically and technically unnecessary because that's why we've seen Chinese companies be able to do the same exact thing with significantly less compute resources. But from Silicon Valley's perspective, like this is what they know. This is how they've been getting gains over the last few years. It is the most intellectually lazy yet most time guaranteed way of achieving the kinds of gains that they hope to achieve, at least it's so it seems for now. And so they're just going to continue pursuing that. And that's why, even though like we've seen scaling base models reach an asymptote, Altman is still talking about building $10 trillion of data centers. It's because like the overall compute scaling has not reached its end from Silicon Valley's perspective.
Yeah, but then there's also the problem with evaluation, right? Not all the AI evaluation is actually because we don't know what's the training data, whether the open source or closed source model, they don't reveal their training data. I think the question now, one of the questions even I have myself is, what should policymakers or even public understand the limits of even the current AI benchmarks? Is there a benchmark actually?
I think what they should understand is that benchmarks are extremely faulty, in part
Mm,
because even determining what benchmark you should use to measure an AI model is more art than science.
mm,
Like, why do we decide to measure some model's capabilities on the LSAT versus the AP biology exam versus like a game
mm.
versus like complex logic puzzles? You know,
Or humanities last exam, which is what they are now base their benchmarks on at the moment.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that's why like benchmarks are constantly shifting again and again and again in ways that are not exactly helping improve public clarity. But the other aspect, which you were getting at, is that we literally don't know what is being put into the models, and therefore any benchmark measuring the capabilities. There's drilling that just started
No, it's
at
okay. I
the
didn't hear
stairs. You hear
anything.
it?
It's
Okay.
okay.
So any of the benchmarks, the results cannot be relied upon because literally the essence of the science of deep learning is that you need to know what goes in to know whether the capabilities on
Yeah,
the
of the
way
neural
out,
networks. Yeah.
yeah, on the way out are actually learned capabilities or just memorization and regurgitation of the training data.
Mm,
And so all of the benchmarks of closed source models are effectively useless.
mm. So if I were to ask you, let's say you look from the other side, right, and provide an argument that is in favor of AI development, not for the sake of just trying to stillman them, what would that argument be then? If there's a path for AI advancement, what would be your argument for AI advancement then?
For scaling,
Yeah, for scaling.
The argument, I think their best argument is that this is an approach that has worked, that is the most predictable because it follows scaling laws. And when you are able to advance AI based on certain types of observable measures, then you can know roughly in advance how capabilities might shift and change. And that in and of itself is helpful to figure out like what outcomes, societal or economic or whatever, might come of the next generation of models. And the other one being that if like if AGI is going to arrive at the end of this path, that it's all going to be worth it. Yeah, so I think there's sort of like multiple different arguments and tacks that they usually take to justify why they're doing this thing.
So, what is the one question you wish more people would ask you about your book, Empire of AI, but they don't?
I don't know if I feel like most of the questions that like I've been surprised the diversity of questions that I've been asked about the book. So I feel like I've often covered almost like pretty much every facet of the
Hmm.
book. But one of the things that I don't cover as often is the journalistic process that went into producing the book.
So,
I
if I
think
ask
is
you what's the journalistic reducing that started the book, can you talk about it now?
yeah, which is like and I think this is sort of part of also why I'm like not very bullish on the idea that AI is ultimately going to take away a ton of jobs that and somehow produce the same quality of those jobs, especially when it comes to information processing. Because some people say like, oh, well, journalism is ultimately information processing, so like, why are we not, you know, just
Automating you
replacing?
away.
Yeah, just automating away journalism. And I think the core thing about my reporting process was like the number one tool for me to connect to like ultimately get all of these details and find all these stories was empathy. Like
Mm.
it required me traveling to a lot of different places and sitting with people for long amounts of time to slowly like to give them a listening ear and to slowly tease out all of the different experiences, lived experiences that they had as part of grappling with the AI industry. And I don't think that can be underestimated in terms like some of the Kenyan workers, for example. Like I spent a week in Kenya, and my interviews with these workers were hours and hours and hours long, sometimes the entire day. And with OpenAI researchers, there were many who sat with me for, 10 hours to recount all of the different things that had happened during their time at the company. And it was ultimately because I took the time to ask them, to build a connection with them, and then to listen and just keep listening and listening and listening and give them that sense that they finally were able to talk about something that was on their mind and that they had lived through. And so yeah, I hope that ultimately the book is not just the content is not just a celebration of like the importance of centering people and centering humanity, but also like the process was as well.
I think of the book as a reflection of where the acceleration goes and some of the human cost that it bears, and what do we need to do to address the human cost. That's my view after reading the book on that. Even though I'm in the AI space myself as an entrepreneur and even teaching it, but I also do bear those costs in mind, that to know that in order for us to reach this, these are the costs that we have to bear. But maybe my last and traditional closing question: what does success mean for you with your book, Empire of AI?
Sparking that conversation that you just mentioned, like helping people realize that there is another side to the equation that is often not talked about. And hopefully, once we have all of the cost and benefits, a more nuanced picture of them, then we can really map out how do we make sure that AI can broadly benefit the global public rather than just a tiny few.
There's a good place to end. Karen, many thanks for coming on for the conversation. I actually truly enjoy your book because it also took me an entire weekend to think through some of the things, and even brought even to some of the things I teach in the university, so that people understand that all these advances that brought about AI, just because you summarize and generate a picture, doesn't mean it doesn't come with actual human cost. So in closing, I have two questions for you. Any recommendations that have inspired you recently?
I really love the book Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit, which
Mm.
is most people would on the surface think that it's not related to my book, but it really is about how to continue having human agency in a world that often feels like it's trying to extract that agency away, and how to build progressive movements that lead to social progress, not just technological progress. And I really enjoy reading Brian Merchant's Substack, Blood in the Machine, as well as this newsletter from Latin America that's in Spanish called La Precisa,
Mm.
that is like a Latin American perspective on AI development.
Mm. So how can my audience find you and your book and your ongoing reporting then?
I'm on Twitter, Blue Sky, LinkedIn. That's where I post all of my work. And I have a website, karendhow.com or empireofai.com.
And you can definitely find us in any of the podcast distribution channels. And of course, subscribe to us at Analyse Asia. And Karen, many thanks for having this conversation. And I'm truly glad to actually be able to talk to the author of the book that I've enjoyed reading. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bernard.